featured in this episode has many lookalikes and it's not easy to find. Just getting to this place has already been an adventure, and now I'm scrambling up a pile of loose rocks. And no, the plant in this episode is not jewelweed, although that is an interesting plant in its own right, one that attracts hummingbirds. Maybe we'll feature jewelweed in another episode. But no, this episode is all about American spikenard, Aurelia racemosa, the plant that's always out of reach. And this is a decent specimen. I can see at least 3 racemes loaded with berries, but as always, just out of reach. Well, maybe this area. There's no way it could grow right out of the middle of a 100-foot-high sandstone cliff, right? Oh, how on earth does it do that? Well, here's a steep, crumbling riverbank that has some. It is a perennial plant, despite its shrub-like appearance. It produces a very large pinnately compound leaf. The stems can be a dark purple, and the nodes can appear swollen. The flowers appear on a large raceme, and it smells a little like perfume or perhaps a little like spices if you manage to grab a leaflet as you slip over the edge of a ravine or whatever it was growing on. Our fishing adventure for this episode takes us to Palisades-Kepler State Park on the Cedar River just east of Cedar Rapids. And if you like botany and mycology and fishing, this will quickly become one of your favorite Iowa parks. Of course, no video about Palisades-Kepler would be complete without a trip through the keyhole, but this staircase is a knee cruncher. I think I'm just about too old for this. At the bottom of the stairs, the impact of 3 years of drought really hits you because the river is still a long ways off. It was somewhere around 3.5 feet on the NWS Cedar Rapids gauge. And since it was late summer, the springtime runs of sturgeon and white bass and so forth are all over with. So we won't see the kind of fishing the park is known for, but there remains a good chance of tangling with long-nosed gar. There's always the possibility of a monster smallmouth, maybe melanistic short-nosed gar. Here's what that fish actually looked like. A really cool catch in my book, at least. A big catfish is a long shot, but not impossible. There's always freshwater drum ready to take a weighted crayfish pattern. The northeast side of the river has the easiest access, so I started there. And it was slow. I did get a nice white bass right below the dam. And the lady fishing with conventional tackle got a nice smallmouth right there as well. And I picked off a small catfish, but pretty soon I paddled over to the southwest side, where the bluffs do create some small eddies that often hold fish, but I wanted to get right up in the corner of the dam again. And the Cedar River this far down is always to be respected, drought or no drought. Normally, if I fly fished the Cedar River, it would be north of Waverly somewhere, so it's kind of a rare treat to be able to fly fish the Cedar River this far down. There were lots of small gar holding in the brake line, so right away I was into those. They are difficult to hook with just a clouser minnow, so I add a treble stinger about an inch behind the fly that has the barbs removed, and is dressed with a few feathers or other materials so it decelerates at the same rate as the fly would cast. Otherwise it will tend to orbit the fly and tangle around the tippet and so forth. Normally I wear leather gloves when I handle these fish. I will probably take a closer look at how to handle these fish safely some other time. But whatever you do, don't do this. Obviously, this is unsafe. Gar teeth are needle-like and somewhat brittle. If you were bitten, they could break off and embed into your skin. So don't handle it like that. So this was probably a gar that struck and shook through the hook. But I did manage to land a nice smallmouth. Not as big as that giant last year, but still a big smallmouth in anybody's book. A lot of rocks, of course. I had switched the fly to a heavy wedge head at some point to sink a little bit faster in that turbulent wave line. And subsequently got a few more white bass. There were quite a few little smallmouth, which is a good sign of a healthy river. And here you can see that treble stinger, probably a size 10 or 8, dressed with flash blue and trailing just behind the fly. This may have been another longnose that struck. It wasn't hooked. And they condition you to make a hard hook set, which sometimes leads to mistakenly pulling a little smallmouth right out of the water. So after a while I moved down to the bluffs. Notice in this clip how I have to cast at an angle due to the bluffs and the forest behind me. And the solution to that is using micro-Skagit gear. And in this case, a 7-foot rod with the OPST 12-foot 200 grain Commando Smooth, which is what they call their integrated lugs. And I've paired that with a 5-foot sink tip. I was getting a lot of bites, but not hooking whatever it was. Probably more small gar, but it could have been goldeye. There was a large goldeye someone had caught and left on the bank that would have been a great fish on the fly rod. Anyway, we'll probably take a closer look at micro-Skagit equipment and techniques in another video. For now, let's jump on into the amateur mycology. Now, we've been focused on caution. In the previous 3 videos, I've looked at some identifying characteristics of poisonous amanitas, as well as the confirmation bias and the Dunning-Kruger curve. So let's take a break from that and tell a story this time. The legend of the Valley of Hens. It's become a legend in my mind, at least, because given the knee trouble I have now, I will probably never see this place again. But it is a real place, where old Highway 30 crosses the Des Moines River just west of Boone. There is a trail running north along the river through some public hunting land to where the river takes a sharp bend below a large sweeping bluff of marl and limestone and clay. And this bend, the hillside, has been cut by fast-moving water draining off the steep hillside into a series of valleys and ridges, steep enough to require a scramble on all fours in some places, which is about as rough as the topology ever gets in Iowa. And of course all this is covered with multiflora rose bushes and greenbriers and poison ivy, but there are some great large grand oak trees scattered through this area, which are partners, of course, with many species of ectomycorrhizal fungi. And also scattered around in this area are groundwater seeps, where rainwater drawn by gravity through the porous clay and limestone and so forth, and sometimes coal, meets the dense marl layer. Groundwater seeps are fairly common along the riverbank, but because the valleys are cut so deeply in this particular area, there are groundwater seeps way back in the forest as well. And there's one of these valleys with a large seep that runs cold and clear even in the heat of summer, that is known by float tubers drifting down the river as a place to cool off on a hot day. But in March, when the walleye run just begins and the forest is still entirely gray, this sheltered large seep is surrounded by bright yellow marsh marigolds, which can bloom even while there still may be ice floating down the river. And over the next ridge is the Valley of Hens. And I call it that because one autumn day, I believe I had paddled from the Highway 30 boat ramp upstream to the bend, and then probably concealed the kayak up in the forest, and then ascended the bluffs from the forested side to where there used to be a giant but half-dead oak tree, where that was a good maitake producer. And I think I probably found a few maitake around it this time, but they were too old to pick. So I hiked as far as the big seep, and I picked a few boletes and shrimp of the woods on the way. That area had a lot of shrimp of the woods for some reason. And shrimp of the woods are a deformed fruiting body that occurs when Armillaria mellia is attacked by Entoloma abortivum, which is fairly rare in this part of Iowa, and so are kind of a tasty surprise when found. But I still hadn't picked any maitake that day. So I crossed over the next ridge, and while scanning the valley below, began counting 1, 2, 3, 4, lots of maitake. Every mature tree had at least one beside it. So I picked as many of the freshest ones as I could carry, and returned to the highway boat ramp eventually with the back of the kayak full of mushrooms. So here we have maitake ravioli. Needless to say, there's a few ugly ducklings in this batch. Definitely my ravioli making technique needs a lot of improvement, but it wound up tasting really good. I'd have to give myself only a 5 out of 10 because although it tasted good, the sauce curdled because I used kefir due to the fact that it is more or less lactose free, but I think the fermentation process that breaks down the lactose is producing like a lactic acid or something, because it has that sour yogurt taste. And of course anything with acid and milk, when you heat them, is going to curdle, which I didn't think about, and I tried to add flour to sort of homogenize it again, but that didn't work. And basically I had the order of operations completely wrong. I should have built a roux first, then added the milk or dairy or whatever I was going to add, and then the cheese once that was up to temperature. So it's sort of an order of operations, and dairy curdling failure on that one, but it tasted really good, so give myself a 5 out of 10. And the whole point of this is that if I can do it, then it isn't really that difficult, and you could probably do it better.